So I'm Ryan Pack.
I'm Brandice.
And this is Soundtrack Your Life, where we talk to a guest about a soundtrack that they feel connected to. Today we are joined by Daniel Efram, photographer, manager, and he also put together the Steve Keene Art Book. So welcome to Soundtrack Your Life, Daniel.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
I am very honored to have you. As I was showing you offline, I own a copy of the Steve Keene Art Book that you have put together.
That's awesome. It's always a pleasure to run into someone that already has the book. That's an exciting thing for me. Thank you.
Yeah, as far as like soundtracking in my life, you know, Steve Keene has done the album covers for some of my favorite records like Pavement's Wowie Zowie and the Apples and Stereo Fun Trick Noisemaker, as well as Tone Soul Evolution, and also like the Silver Jews records like American Water. So, huge honor to have someone that is connected to, you know, the artwork of Steve Keene and put together this awesome book that I immediately bought when I found out it existed.
Oh, well, thank you. I really appreciate it. It's been a fun journey.
So we'll get more into that in a little bit, but today we are going to talk about the 1997 George Armitage film Grosse Pointe Blank. So Daniel, why did you pick Grosse Pointe Blank?
Well, I hadn't watched it in a long time, and I thought, you know, it was kind of ripe for being rewatched because I was looking for soundtracks that, okay, what really spoke to me? I was like, oh, wait, forgot, Grosse Pointe Blank. And I actually asked the Steve Keene group of community. I was like, what soundtrack I'm going on this podcast, what soundtracks do you like? And they just to see what they were, if I was missing anything. And a couple of them mentioned, I was like, yeah, I got to check that one out. And I looked it up, and I love it because it's dominated by Joe Strummer based and the Clash based music from that era, or from his world, if you will. It seems like it's primary. And it turns out that I've noticed he has a credit in the opening credits that, you know, music from Joe Strummer is in the beginning credits. And then I thought, oh, of course, this is why I love this film. And it's watching it again, it was actually quite enjoyable, funny film. So all good things all around. Funny, containing good music. Hey, we're in.
Yeah, and I think Joe Strummer scored the movie. Not that there's like a ton of score, but he actually scored it as well.
I'm pretty sure. I think you're right. That's what I was thinking. Yes, and you know, it didn't seem like there was a ton of score, but you know, I'll take it if it says Joe Strummer. I'll take it.
Yeah, there wasn't a ton of use of music in the film, like altogether. If you like maybe compare it to like some other films, there were a lot of like quiet moments, which really made the use of songs and scoring, you know, like really like jump out in the moments when they like were there. It was really interesting because I think that like lately we've been like talking a lot about like soundtracks or movies that have just like wall to wall, you know, like music, and there were just so many long periods of quiet that didn't have it. And so it was just like really interesting like mix of like how the songs like came into play with the movie too.
I think that's I mean, you guys are more the experts than I am in this, but it would seem like when it is you know, there's a specific choice that they're making to include score in these positions or not. And it is interesting when that balance is shifted. It seems to me that some of the biggest films that are made, they always have wall-to-wall score, or it would seem. Again, you know, always is probably the wrong word to use, but it would seem to me like it's big films seem to have this kitchen sink approach to almost every facet of it. And so I think you're right, Brad. It's like it's cool to have heard the moments of silence in there as well, especially because it's a quirky film and it's got a lot of humor to it. So it's always moving, and I also think it's fun that because it's always moving. It has such a pace to the film and the editing. I think it's they really do use the score well. Upon watching it again for the first time in a long time, I think they use it well. Additionally,
Yeah, it was my second time seeing the film, and again, like, it had been a long time since the first time I'd seen it, and so it was, like, plot-wise, obviously, it wasn't new to me, but I didn't remember anything about, like, the soundtrack. I didn't really remember anything about, like, how off the wall, like, the dialogue was, and so I was, like, definitely rediscovering these things almost as if it was, like, a first watch, and it is a ton of fun, and you're right, the editing is, like, really fast-paced. Like, there may be quiet moments in the film from, like, a musicality standpoint, but in terms of like pacing, there are no quiet moments in that film. It is like definitely bonkers and a ton of fun.
Yeah, and it's a movie about a hitman, so it wouldn't make sense for all this soundtrack to be constantly going while this guy's, lining up trying to shoot a guy.
Right, like I completely forgot about, like, I guess spoiler alert, but it's been out for a while, so fair game. I
spoiler alert! Spoiler alert for 25 years of
right,
spoiling.
yeah.
Yeah, Brandice, how dare you spoil that for us,
I like
Brandice? Shame on you.
sorry. If you haven't seen the movie, hit pause, go watch it, then come back. I completely forgot about the second hit where he's like sending the poison like down the stream. And I was like, oh my God, that's so slick. And then the guy's face moved and I'm like, okay, maybe that's not so slick. I like completely forgot about that scene. So great.
I totally did too. That is a really amazing scene. When I was watching it, I thought the same thing. I thought, wow, I totally forgot about this. And and then B, that's super creative. Wow. And I think C was, wow, I hope no one ever does that to me. But anyway, that was something
Did
else.
everyone like immediately go into their bedroom and make sure there were like no vents like above their bed?
Yeah, that's just poor room design.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, come on. Or maybe poor bed placement.
That's true. It's a combination of bad
Yes.
factors.
I'm going to let you guys talk about the soundtrack for a bit before I come in guns blazing because I have a bit of an unpopular opinion and I don't want to like swing the conversation. So I'm just going to put that out there. You guys do you for a few minutes and then I'll come in.
She's worried she's going to offend you. Though Apples in Stereo are not on the soundtrack, so I'm not sure why.
I mean, I'm already offended just being here, so
great. I'll just pile on.
Yeah, I mean, feel free. I'm a bit of a punching bag anyway, so friends will know this. It's fine. But anyway, yeah. Where do we go from here, Ryan? You're steering this ship. Brandice has signed off, so
her soul has left her body temporarily. She'll be back. So this came out in 1997, and so ska had permeated pop culture at this point. So No Doubt is huge, and all these ska bands are showing up on the radio and on MTV. But the ska on this soundtrack is from the 80s, and to me it opened a whole new world. Like I was like, oh, so this is what ska is. Not, I mean. There are some bands in the 90s that I ended up enjoying, like Skankin' Pickle and Operation Ivy and stuff. But, I had heard, that Joe Strummer was associated with ska. But from the Clash radio songs that I had heard up to this point, I didn't understand the connection, Rock the Casbah and, Should I Stay or Should I Go? Like, those songs don't sound like ska at all. Or I Fought the Law, which is a cover anyways. But, these were more like just kind of like punk or just rock songs to me. So this was the first exposure for me to the Clash's kind of more ska dub side.
Well, their album Sandinista is, known for it. That's what most of that album is referencing. So when you get to they're known that was their last studio album. So when you get to that part of their career, which when Sandinista came out, I'm not certain it was. I think it was kind of not as it was embraced, but not in the same way as some of their other albums because it was such a departure. and it's a massive album. And I think it's originally it was three sides of vinyl originally. So it's a big album in terms of a large scope that it covers musically, and a lot of this. So that was in the '80s. That was their last album. So last studio album. So that was really like where I think people really started to see not just the obviously they'd cover all they'd covered some songs before this, but at this point in their career, at the end was when they really started to experiment more in the studio, and they had the time to do it, or at least more time to do it, and they felt like they could unleash themselves, I guess, or they weren't tethered to a specific thing, and so I think this really references. I think Sandinista really references a lot of their love for dub more than really anything else in their career, if I could be so bold to say that. Obviously, they have other influences in there, but in terms of album and actual music, in terms of the full album's cycle or the full album full of compositions, I think that's what represents it the most.
Yeah, and I feel like everything kind of branches off from there, and maybe because the basis of the soundtrack isn't like the radio songs of the Clash, it doesn't feel like this 80s nostalgia grab, even though it is a very 80s sort of soundtrack.
That's an interesting thing. I don't know that I don't I'm on the fence about that. I don't think it's nostalgia. Well, I should say that I mean the whole premise of the film might be nostalgia in a way because he's going back to
High
his
school reunion, yeah.
high school
10-year
reunion.
Yeah.
I mean, just thinking about this with you, I wasn't clear on it necessarily.
You have
But
Minnie Driver when
it,
she's acting as like the radio host, and she's like, I'm gonna take you back to like the 80s or whatever. There is that like middle chunk of the soundtrack that's played sort of like in tandem with like her choosing songs. It's like, look, going back to the 80s. But then it's interesting that like before that, like when he's still in LA, him being like, hitman killer or whatever, when he's still in LA, and then toward the end, it's like you're outside of the 80s, but this chunk when he's like back in his hometown, in a home for like the high school reunion, that's when it's like you're in the 80s. So I do think that it was one of the things I do really like about the soundtrack is like thinking so much about like the timing of that, and then it's like this middle time capsule, and then outside of that they like opened it up a bit. Like that was a lot of intentionality there with, yeah, I think there is a lot of like nostalgia and like, can you go home? He goes back to his old house and it's like not there, it's blown up, it's a mini mart, right? So like he literally calls his like therapist and he's like, I guess you can't go home. So I really do like that, like, you have that whole middle part. And again, intelligently using Minnie Driver as like a radio host to, as a reason to play songs from like the 80s. So it's not just like this weird, like, oh, we only chose a song from the 80s. Like there's a reason for it, like in the narrative of the film.
So you're directly contradicting Ryan right now, just to be clear. And so they're not.
Yes
I don't think they're.
no.
I don't think they're in the same room. But for you listening out there, there's a little bit of a war going on.
Oh, that's part for the course. We rarely ever agree on these things.
Well, I guess I'll clarify my point with. It's funny because now Daniel is hosting the show and Brandice and I are arguing with each other.
Yes. It's worked. My plan has worked.
I guess it doesn't kind of feel like that's a cynical nostalgia grab. Like the music is nostalgic, but it's not like that, oh, let's put, the most popular songs from the 80s in this movie.
Yeah.
Like that sort of nostalgia grab where, where it's hitting you over the head with, this is the 80s. Like we've got Rio and we've got, In Excess, and we're going to just pound you with the biggest pop songs of the 80s so we're talking about the 80s.
How do you feel about that, Brandice?
I actually agree. And one thing that I will like pile on that is one of my biggest issues with this, and I can't say soundtrack because technically the song isn't on the soundtrack, but it is used in the film at a very pivotal moment, is the use of 99 Luftballons. And it's like, that was such like, if you want to like ask any person on the street of like a famous song from like pop song from that era, it's like, okay, that one, you know, everyone knows, it's been covered a million times. And so not only did it feel like such a shallow cut to be playing like at that time, even though it was playing literally at the time of the high school reunion, so I can see it playing at a high school reunion, it just felt like it stood out in terms of like that level of like super mainstream popularity. It stood out in terms of like genre. It also stood out, and this is like a little bit of
So it in a negative way for
way,
you.
yeah. Like it just felt like a huge like record scratch to me of like, why is this song in this film? Like, what is happening? And then, you know, I don't want to get into it yet, but in terms of like the lyrics, throughout this film, like a lot of the songs, the lyrics are very on the nose. But then this one song, the lyrics like have absolutely nothing to do with like what's happening other than they're carrying a dead body wrapped in a red banner. And I'm like, okay, well now that's a stretch. So like that song was super weird choice to me. So I think that I agree with you, Ryan, in that I think it's total nostalgia, but it's not like those super obvious, you know, like 80s nostalgia songs until you get to 99 Luftballons. And again, it's not on the soundtrack, but it is played for like a very large chunk of that scene where he's killing someone at the high school reunion. Again, spoiler.
Well, I wonder if you know, all these things. I've music supervised a few films. They're totally small films. You've never heard of them. Most people have never heard of them. But it was it was an interesting experience to be involved with this, and to try and navigate like these types of questions. And so for what I'm wondering, though it never happened with the film that I worked on, because these films were tiny films, I wonder about the studio, and if, because the songs that were being chosen and were not the biggest of songs, they were important songs. I mean, these are, you know, all of them I think were fairly important songs. Might even have been the biggest songs of the specific bands that were represented at the time of their careers, but they were not huge mainstream successes. Echo and the Bunnymen isn't a huge mainstream success. So with 99 Luftballons, it was a song that crossed every genre. It just went huge. So I wonder if like that was actually a studio suggested compromise, or, you know, here's three choices for this, you know, for this scene, right? It's going to have music because there's a lot of movement going on, but there's no dialogue. So there's going to be music. Here are your three choices, and you know, this is the one that they could decide on together. Perhaps it was the one the studio kind of wedged in there. You know, I wonder.
Yeah, it does raise a lot of questions because it felt very, you know, like just off brand for the people who are involved in this film too. Like it just felt like such a weird choice. So maybe it was like a studio thing. Yeah, I was just like super shocked because obviously, like I said, it'd been so long. I did not remember at all that that song was in there. And I was just like, whoa, that's weird.
Well, you know, one of the other things that to think about, again, this is about more about the perhaps the commerce of the film, but and you might not be interested in this, so tell me to,
Super
you know,
interested.
shut me off at any point.
Always interested.
It's a soundtrack podcast. We're
Oh,
totally
okay,
interested.
all right. Sorry, we're going deep here, folks. So, you know, one of the things that's interesting to in this conversation specifically about this song, this so 99 Luftballons is a huge song around the world. It's probably, you know, one of the biggest singles of all time. It probably top 50 biggest singles of all time around the world, I would guess. And especially during the 80s, especially at that time. So if you're looking at 90s, it's being played on modern commercial alternative radio as a nostalgia track in programming, where terrestrial radio is still a huge format at that time, still is now, but it's diminished quite a bit. At that point, you know, there's no iPod, there's no streaming services. It's being played hugely, like In Excess biggest songs, like Duran Duran's biggest songs, as alternative nostalgia on modern rock radio and some pop radio as nostalgia. So we have that in the US. But dig it. Let's go over to Europe. And we're talking about the Clash, and we're talking about Joe Strummer being the soundtrack score composer, and we're talking about all this Clash and English music that is big in this film. And when you talk about specifically about Europe, and then even more micro, you're talking about England. We've all seen how songs reappear in the charts from different decades. The Beatles had a number one hit in the 2000s. So at that time, 1997, they put out this film. It's got John Cusack and all these great of the moment actors. It's theoretically could be a big film, and I think it did rather well. I don't know if it was a huge hit or if it was just a cult hit, but it did fairly well. I wonder if they were also trying to figure out if they could come up with that combination where one of the tracks from the album soundtrack, which is a CD-based, product at this point, they're selling soundtracks are being sold. They're massive ones are being sold. And it's a big deal, big commerce coming from soundtracks at that point. Unlike now, where it's a streaming, soundtrack, you're not necessarily buying a physical piece anymore, and there's a diminished market dramatically in physical form. Then it's a huge, physical form. This is selling. This could be a top 10 record in many markets around the world because of this sort of niche music that it's bringing together in the soundtrack. It's like the ultimate. If it's the ultimate Joe Strummer, it's almost like the Joe Strummer soundtrack. So if it's the Joe Strummer soundtrack and you're selling it that way, I wonder if this album charted as a soundtrack album, but for sales as an album in the UK.
I know it did well in the US.
So it must have done way better than in the UK. You know what I mean? So I don't know. This is a lot of supposition.
It's always follow the money when it comes to soundtracks.
Absolutely.
But yeah, it actually spawned a second volume. It did so well in the US.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. So there's the main soundtrack, and then they add some of the other songs that were in the movie that didn't appear on the first soundtrack. Then they made a second volume. They've done the same thing with like Dazed and Confused, and I think Pulp Fiction as well.
See, I'm pretending I didn't know that because that would eliminate how smart I sounded, just moments ago. That I had such insight.
I didn't know that. I thought we were talking about volume 1 as the only volume. I did not know that there were 2.
I don't think I knew there was 2 until I looked it up.
I didn't remember that. So I assure you folks listening out there, thousands of people are listening. I'm totally, I didn't realize it.
Yeah. 2 small fun facts though. You just mentioned Pulp Fiction. Did anyone else catch the Pulp Fiction cutout in the mini mart when Cusack and the ghoul guy are dueling it out?
No, I didn't see that.
In the back of the mini mart, we always have the cold fridges with all the beverages. Way in the corner was this life-size cutout of the Pulp Fiction characters, and I was like, oh, nice nod there.
Oh, that's hilarious. I did not see that. Did you see that, Ryan?
I think I remember. I don't think I caught it on the second rewatch. I've watched this a lot because I don't know who bought it in my house, but we had a copy of Grosse Pointe Blank on VHS, so I watched it quite a bit. So I remember catching it when I was in high school with friends. Oh, it's like Pulp Fiction. Are they dunking on Pulp Fiction? I'm not quite sure what the reference is.
I think it's a love letter. Yeah, it's if you have the super infamous scene of the 2 main characters, I don't know main characters, but you have the 2 hitmen kind of having this existential crisis, being super philosophical about their lives and their jobs, and then I feel it's taking that moment that everyone remembers from Pulp Fiction and then spreading it out across the whole movie,
a lot of the reviews definitely point to there's a connection between the 2 movies. Or that they were surprised that it was hard to get this movie made since there was the success of Pulp Fiction just a few years earlier.
I'm surprised it was hard to get made since it was a Cusack film anyway, and a whole family affair. Another fun film. There were 4
I did catch
of
that
them
in the credits
in this movie. Yes, there are 4 Cusacks. Also, I think Joan made it. She was the MVP of this film.
Yeah,
absolutely.
I think Joan
loved her
and
character.
Alan Arkin, the psychiatrist. I think they definitely provide
Mhm.
like really awesome comic relief. Like everything is like so low key and subdued to a certain extent
Yeah.
as far as like character wise. And then you just have, I mean, I guess Dan Aykroyd is pretty out there, but
Mhm.
like between John Cusack and Minnie Driver, I feel like it's very like low key and intimate. And then you have like people freaking out on the phone.
Right? It's very restrained in terms of like its hitmen like shooting each other up. Like that's actually pretty restrained. But the calling the psychiatrist and Joan Cusack like trashing the office, those are like your most like wacky, like high energy like moments. I absolutely love it. Like they definitely stole the show. I agree. Going back to Luftballons just one more time before we like go back to the overall soundtrack. Ryan, before we started recording, you had mentioned you were talking about the trailer. You rewatched the trailer,
Oh
which
yeah,
is
90s
always a
trailers. Oh
gem
my
to go back
gosh.
and watch old movie trailers because they're
Yeah, it made it sound like this
bonkers.
wacky comedy, and it's all set to the keyboard solo in Left Balloons, and it's like, what should you not do when you go back to your 10-year reunion? And it was just like, what? And it totally made it seem like this super wacky movie. And I mean, it is wacky, but like in a different way. Like if you watch the trailer, you would be expecting like pies in the face, and like stepping on rakes and stuff, like really slapstick and like just very broad. Like this movie is very, like, it's definitely a different tone. Like it's if you're thinking of like mainstream like 90s, like it's the opposite of like Austin Powers, you know. Like you can enjoy both,
Mhm.
but you can't expect one and
Yeah,
get the
it's
other, you know.
definitely not. Yeah, it's not like broad comedy. It's very like nuanced and like idiosyncratic, and it has like a lot of like indie feel to it, especially in that really wacky dialogue that's like happening between all the characters. But I think that's also kind of like reflective in the music choices, right? Because a lot of the songs are not 99 Luft Balloons. They're like, you know, deeper cuts, a little bit more nuanced. And you have that like big song that's just like, again, where did that come from? And then similarly in the trailer's cut a little bit more broad comedy. And then that, of course, is the song that the trailer is cut to. Not that movie trailers always include music from movies, they usually don't. But that is just an interesting choice that I didn't know either because I hadn't watched the trailer. But it was just shocking to me that when you said, oh, it's cut to like the instrumental, and I was like, of all the songs, that's the one that the trailer is cut to. But it makes sense. Like we were talking about like nostalgia, high school reunions, that song probably would be playing real life at that reunion. So it makes sense if that's what they were zeroing in on for that movie trailer, that that's the song that it would be cut to.
That's true. I did watch the trailer, and I was to pick. I was like, I was watching trailers again, and I did think that when I saw this film, that it was a little bit different. And but in a way, it gave me more excitement to watch it, even though it really didn't represent it in the same way that I think the film, like like you guys put far more eloquently than I will, didn't necessarily represent it. It it got me to watch it. So again, so I guess it worked in its if that's what trailers are supposed to get you to watch it, right? So it worked. It's slightly different than what it presented, but that's not so unusual.
Well, I just think it's funny also, I think on Amazon, like, the description of the movie, or maybe not the description, but it's like, oh, featuring Academy Award nominee Dan Aykroyd for Little Miss Daisy, or Driving Miss Daisy. And I'm like, that's not what people remember Dan Aykroyd from.
Yeah,
You know, it's
exactly.
like they're trying to make it sound like, oh, we got this huge cast of Academy nominated and winning people to make this
That
movie,
was
and I'm
that
like,
was Dan's agent who was trying to get Dan into more serious roles, saying like, okay, when you here's his credit for the film. Like that's
right.
what that was.
Oh, we got the girl from Good Will Hunting, and we got the guy from Driving Miss Daisy,
Yeah, the
and we,
guy from Driving Miss Daisy,
Yeah,
right?
I saw
We
that
got the
too.
guy
yeah,
from Driving
I
Miss.
read that too, and I was like, that's not the tone of this film.
yeah, be like it's the guy from Ghostbusters
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
or
you
Coneheads,
know,
like,
I mean, any number of references. This is the last thing he would be known for. I mean, it's kind of strange in a way.
Especially for
Like, why
touting
would
this
you?
film when you're trying to get people to watch. It's like, yeah, Ghostbusters.
And
If you
it,
like
that it's fun.
Ghostbusters,
That it's right. That was entertaining film. This is an entertaining film too. And anyway, yeah, that's really strange. Like, very serious film. Yeah, it's it's like, and now let's put Orson Welles in, from his role in Ghostbusters. What? Like,
Yeah,
no, you don't
featuring
do
Orson Welles
that.
from the
That's
Transformers movie.
yeah.
all right, what about so we kind of talked about how we feel about the soundtrack overall and like genre wise, but how do we feel about like individual song choices at individual moments?
I mean, it's weird because I think in a movie now, if you were to play Blister in the Sun, I'd be like, too on the nose. But I think it works a little bit better in this movie. I know that maybe you don't agree, Brandis.
No, I love that you said two on the nose because that's the perfect segue for my feelings. All right, strap in, everyone. Unpopular opinion. I actually strongly dislike this soundtrack, not necessarily as a musical collection, right? Like standalone, like the music and such, but I am so annoyed by these songs matching up with like the moments in the film. And I feel like it's going to be just like a rant of like when I went off on High Fidelity because it's a lot of the same reasons, although I've had more time to think about it. So maybe it's a little bit more eloquent. But so many times, like these songs were like so on the nose for like what was happening, like lyrically. Um, like for example, you open with "I Can See Clearly Now" over like black screen and credits, hard cut to like Cusack like rinsing his eye out with like eye wash, right? And it's like, okay, come on, really? Like, and then you go a few more moments in, and the song continues with the lyrics like "Obstacles in My Way" as like the bicyclist who's being shot down like runs into like a cab, and then continue on with the lyrics. And then it's like "Sunshiny Day" as like Dan like shoots down like the entire entourage of like security people. It's like so perfectly on the nose that it's like distracting. It's like literally like the lyrics in the song are just describing what's happening in the film. Um, when
I
Cusack
like the
goes and
irony
sees
of
that
it,
his
though.
house is like bulldozed, it's like we're saying "Live and Let Die," and it's like, okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then you're at the reunion where he's like freaking out because he's meeting all these people. We start hearing "Under Pressure," but then cut to like the rest of the lyrics where it's like "Love dares us" as he's looking into the eyes of this baby, and it's just so on the nose, and it's just like being so cute with like those song selections lyrically that I was just like, I was so distracted. Granted, as I'm watching this film, I'm watching it for a podcast talking about soundtracks, so I'm paying a little bit more attention than the average watcher. But I was just like, I felt like it was so
Well,
distracting.
if you're watching it also for the second time too, or third
Mm-hmm.
time, but I think your points are super right. Right on the nose. It's really interesting to again, having been part of the process in my own way as well, like trying to figure out how to approach films, in making these selections. It is a really interesting thing. I remember fighting with my producers and directors, innumerable times about this type of discussion specifically. Like, it's just too obvious. It's you know what's the balance between what is on the page, script, the visual, and then the sound, like, and soundtrack. What is the balance here that we're trying to strike? And it can be real delicate. So,
Yeah.
for example, I can envision in thinking about what your criticisms are, which I think are really valid. Um, you know, the if you think about switching up a quarter of these references and choices, it would throw the balance completely, maybe not completely, but it would change the balance perhaps of how you feel.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe those other selections would be fine if it was switched up just a little bit. But I think it is interesting that you point out there are a lot of really on point to on point references that way. It's interesting to me to think about how that balance would change with just 3 different choices or just 4 different choices and where they're placed.
Yeah.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, do that like maybe a couple of times, like with intentionality, but like maybe you don't do it with like every single song. And then maybe Luftballons wouldn't have been so weird for me, because I'm like, why are you talking about like bombs and warfare when he's carrying a body just because it's in a red banner? What? Like, that wasn't on the nose. That was really weird. But yeah, no, it's like, for me, it's like finding, it's like finding that balance between like, yes, is it lyrically relevant, but also like the genre, the instrumentation, the energy of the song, like, does that match the mood of like what's happening or the mood of the characters? And I feel like not just this film, but also High Fidelity as well, it's like so far in the camp of like, what are the lyrics and not necessarily what is that instrumentation and like tone and, you know, energy of the song too.
I think you just don't like Kathy Nelson because she was a soundtrack supervisor for both films.
Well, I mean, it makes sense,
and also, I think
right?
Cusack had a huge hand in both as well.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying, is there's a pattern here. Like, I think that together they make these choices of focusing more on lyrics than necessarily like the energy or like the pacing and in their song selection. And I think that maybe I just don't like gel with that well.
What was the other film they worked on together?
Fidelity.
High Fidelity.
She worked on that too. Interesting. Yeah, that's interesting.
Which is why I said unpopular opinion, because High Fidelity is like one of the most beloved soundtracks, you know, like of all time. And I was like, nope, not here for it.
I am going to disagree with you. I really do like the juxtaposition of I Can See Freely Now, like this very kind of gentle and positive, uncynical song with this guy getting ready to shoot somebody. Like, I think it's played kind of for humor there. So I mean, some of the other examples I can see why it would be kind of annoying how on the nose there, but I feel like that one is kind of played for like laughs. Like, it's definitely not what you're expecting when you hear that song is, I'm going to get ready to not take this guy out.
See, in that respect alone, I would have loved it. I would have loved the positive upbeat, you know, like going into he's about to like gun people down with like a cold hard killer because he's like just doesn't care. It was specifically the words "I can see clearly now" over a black screen cut to Visine. It was like, seriously, like, you didn't do that like by accident. If it had just been like, you know, I can see clearly now as, you know, he's like preparing, not looking down a scope of a gun, because that also would have been too on the nose, but like just, you know, like cleaning his gun or like putting it together as he's like about to create this, like do this contract kill, I would have been like, oh, a nice juxtaposition there. It was literally just those specific words in the lyrics literally matched up to these scenes of the shot.
I mean, there's a bunch of other examples that you didn't even bring up, so that I have noted here as well. So, like, for example, Rudy Can't Fail. You know, they're on the mission. You know, in the cars, they're kind of one set of, you know, Cusack's stalkers are following him in the car, and you know, they're basically, you know, they're both trying to kill each other in essence, but you know, like, it's a little bit, that to me came up as one of these things where, oh, I'm not sure that really works so well. I love the song. Again, it's not about whether you love the song, it's whether or not it fits in the movie and is a distraction. I noted that. Another thing that I thought did work, though, that wasn't on the nose, was when the mark gets blown up and they use Ace of Spades. That, to me, was like a good usage. Like, that worked because it wasn't so on the nose, and it also had this, because it's, you know, such a also, you know, a really important track. It was used in a way that I hadn't seen, but also with a humor, and which I really like. That, because when I think of Ace of Spades, it's not about humor. So using in that humorous way, I thought that was actually a good touch. But again, I would agree with you that most of the a lot of the choices were so on the nose. Sometimes they were distracting. I agree with you there. Another thing I thought was interesting, that I wish they would have used, because I thought that it could have helped, was when Minnie Driver is one of her voiceovers, like in between, um, you know, um, in between tracks when she's on air as the DJ. She mentions that there's like a palace show that you can go and check. That they're playing that night, and like if they had played a Palace song, that perhaps would have really changed the whole, not the whole thing, but because it's such a different, Palace is such a different style of music as a whole. That would have been really interesting to do that. For me as a listener, um, it's distracting when you know all the songs so well.
Mm-hmm.
And I knew every song so well, and so I like all the songs individually, and I love the Clash, and I love Joe Strummer, so I love all those things. But when you know it all, it does. I think it does really hurt, or not hurt, but it changes your feeling about what's going on. It ends up just being more of a distraction if you're that familiar. And then because it also, just like Lift Balloons was, this huge song, all these other songs are big to me in the sense that I know them so well. So they all have a representational, they have some meaning to me in some way. So my mind is recalling those meanings, whether I'm realizing exactly why it is or not.
Mm-hmm.
So it does have this, and they're obviously making this as a calculated choice that this is going to be good for people, which, that's why this is a pop art film and not a art film. It's a pop film.
Yeah.
It's a mainstream film. That's what it is. It had maybe this would have been considered an edgier soundtrack at the time, but at the time, I think that soundtracks were done this way. Okay, let's have the Alterna soundtrack, or we're gonna have the mainstream soundtrack. We're gonna have the jazz soundtrack for the older folks. Is it gonna be James Taylor? Like is it a James Taylor and Carole King soundtrack? These are your different buckets. How
Yeah.
and that's how it was done back then. And I think that's very much part of music supervision as a whole. Like, what bucket is this going to be in? And I think the good thing I think about now is that I there are so I think it's a lot broader, and I think your options are a lot more. There's a lot more options out there now. I don't think the buckets are as clearly defined. The hits aren't quite as big. Some of the hits are bigger than they've ever been because they've been streamed quantifiably. You can see they've been streamed a billion times. So when you choose Rihanna's Umbrella, you know that it's like this thing and it's its own bucket. But by the same token, there are so many songs and so many different artists that have really rabid followings now that I've never heard of, you've never heard of, because you can't hear of them all.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow they found this really, this song has found a huge audience now, TikTok, Reel, whatever it is, and you might not have ever heard anything else by that artist. So all of this is really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I agree with you. Like in modern day, like supervision, you do have a little bit like more freedom to be a little bit more experimental with like the different genres and the different people versus like sticking to those like more obvious broader choices like you're saying. Like to that end, in addition to 99 Lift Balloons feeling like a little bit too big, I also thought that Guns N' Roses Live and Let Die, I was like, oh wow, okay. that's like that's a real banner song here, like especially like at this moment, because it was, he sees his house as being bulldozed, and I already said that lyrically it's on the nose, but it felt like it was supposed to be very poignant, kind of like quiet, small moment, but then you're putting it against like a song that's been played on the radio like ad nauseum, right? And it's just like, that was distracting too. And then I also like what you said about when you're so familiar with songs, like, yes, it's like, what do you bring personally into it? But even if you don't bring personal emotions into it, if you just have heard it so many times, you're going to be singing along in your head instead of paying attention to the moment in the film, right? Like when you're playing a song like that. So it was just like, yeah, like Live and Let Die for a number of reasons was also a record scratch moment for me, because it was just like, whoa, okay.
So counterpoint.
Yes.
So I was reading this 20th anniversary retrospective of the soundtrack on the AV Club by Gwen Inat. I think that's how you say the name. And I think they do this in high fidelity too, which is why you don't like it. And it's kind of, this is the soundtrack of how the main character is feeling.
Mm-hmm.
Like the headline of this article is Grosse Pointe Blank soundtrack reveals what its main character couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so they kind of see it as this is their inner soundtrack. And especially because, Martin Blank kind of a little bit more on the stoic side, because he is kind of this person who can compartmentalize his emotions to be able to kill people.
Mm-hmm. I feel that. I agree with that. And I don't hate that. But again, is there a way that you can do it through also like tone and instrumentation and pacing and things like that aren't literally just hanging your laurels on the title of the song or like a line from like the chorus, right?
I think at the time, this really harkens back to the time so dramatically in the commerce. They wanted a hit soundtrack and they wanted to sell CDs from it because that's a big revenue source for the soundtrack at the time. That was a big deal. I don't know who put out the soundtrack off the top of my head. I don't have those notes in front of me. I bet you Ryan does. I bet you do, Brenda. But I don't. But based on who that put that out as well, you can tell if it was it wasn't a Disney film, but if Hollywood Records put out the soundtrack, it would be one thing. And because I worked in that field of the music side of it, I would be sometimes I'd be able to help figure out, oh, okay, well, here's what they were trying to do probably. But obviously they were trying to have a hit soundtrack. And what I don't like is when that's what I didn't like about music soundtracks of the time, is that they had to have this component of a hit soundtrack. Now it might be a hit song because things are streaming. It's not, again, being sold physically anymore. It's a little different. You can focus on one song. That's different. This was like, I want to have a hit soundtrack. I want to sell a whole CD. It's and it felt very much like, here's the film, and we're going to have this soundtrack, and we're going to try and sell them both because we're not sure the film is going to sell, but we think we can sell a hit soundtrack. So, let's what is it? What's the way of putting it? Let's try and give our best chance to make back as much money as possible because we're not certain of the film or something. I don't know. Maybe that's one. I don't know. I think the film is actually, in some ways, the film is better than the soundtrack indicates in terms of what do I mean by this? What I'm trying to say is that I think that the film's ideas are really good, and that that the soundtrack can be like I agree with you, that can be overwhelming. Independently, they both work. Independently, both the soundtrack works on its own, and the film would work on its own. But this soundtrack is so big that it kind of overcooks in my head, perhaps, how good the film might even be, because it's so like, I think what this conversation is about is really back to that it's overwhelming in some places for some of us.
Yeah,
I don't want to speak for Ryan.
For 2/3 at least.
I think you convinced me of this, honestly. I don't know that I went into it thinking like this either, and that's not a bad thing. This is a good critical conversation about this. I haven't thought about some of these issues in a while, and it's cool. So I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can see Brandice's points. I don't think I necessarily disagree with them, but I think that you can enjoy them because they are on the nose as well. Like it's not distastefully done where it like completely
No, no,
removes you
no.
from the
I don't think
movie.
so. I think that there's different. Here's what I think. I think there's different types of listeners for this and viewers of this film. So if you go into it and you don't know any of the music, then there you go. It's not going to be an issue. None of what we're talking about is really going to be an issue, right? You can just enjoy the film. But if you're like a super music nerd and you've been like listening to, you know, um, deep cuts, by the Clash and you know, Echo and the Bunnymen, and this is your like genre that you've been, and it's all like, well, we know this really well. It has such these songs already have such meaning. Then you're in a different sort of populace, and I think that for the music supervisor or the salespeople of this, or the people making the film, I think that, you know, they're trying to quantify it. Everything's about, you know, it's a major studio film. Got John Cusack, got a big cast in there. Going to be big. Soundtrack's going to be big. Everything's going to be big. You know, like it's big.
Well, I think this
Uh,
soundtrack is trying to toe that line between like it is kind of artsy, but it is kind of big as well,
oh,
right?
agreed.
And
Agree
Kathy
with you.
Nelson has done both, right? So she's done Eternal Sunshine, but she's also done Love Actually and Armageddon. Like she has a broad range of what she's done, and I think this is trying to find that middle ground because that's kind of it's a studio picture, but it's not like a big budget picture. Like it feels very
Mhm.
small. This is not the Fast and the Furious. This is a much smaller sort of film, and it's meant to feel smaller. So it's trying to toe that line in a lot of ways, and maybe it doesn't work. Like Blister in the Sun, like that's not a deep cut, right?
Right.
And
No.
I think when I saw the movie, it didn't really do much for me. I wasn't like, oh, cool. Listen, I was like, I guess. But
Yeah.
there's a
Yeah.
but for
I
me,
think that.
like it was an introduction to a lot of music that maybe I wasn't familiar with, and obviously there's no streaming, right? So it was hearing a different side of the Clash or hearing maybe some a different side of the Jam that I wasn't used to. So in a lot of ways, for me, it was very cool. But also, yeah, I was like, oh, live and let die. Okay.
If they, I really, I think they should have used a Palace song in one of those more, in the one, like that one moment where, uh, the, where John Cusack's character is like kind of like, coming clean to Minnie Driver about everything, and it's that one sort of tender moment where it isn't rushing around. Like if they were going to use something, that would have been a time to use that. I don't think they used any music in that particular scene, if I'm not mistaken. They might have used score, they might have been nothing, or something so subtle that it was barely there, which is also fine. I wouldn't have used it in a big way, but it could have been just an instrumental part of Will Oldham strumming acoustic guitar. That's the type of thing where I think it would have been nice to have that sort of subtle thing. I think the point of all this, we keep going back to it, but there's a lack of subtlety. It can work by design, or it doesn't necessarily work by design. In this case, I think it works sometimes and doesn't work other times for me.
Mhm. Yeah. And as for like the overall like music selection standing on its own, like yeah, I think it's like a great collection of songs with the exception of Blister in the Sun because I just personally cannot handle that song. And so it was insult to injury that
That's your
that song was
problem.
played
That's your
twice.
problem.
We're gonna
That's
open
your
and close
problem.
with
That's your
this. Yeah,
problem.
it's my problem for sure. It has been stuck in my head. It is still stuck in my head now, and I take personal offense. So maybe I'm coming into this a little hot because I'm still like offended.
Offended. Wow, she's
You're
offended.
double offended.
Wow, offended. This is a strong word.
That song just
Okay,
really
well,
grates my brain.
I totally get it. I listened to it so much at one point in the 80s and then didn't want to ever hear them again. And I was wrong because actually their other albums are actually really good. And they really faced a lot of real problems because of how important that one record was. It's really interesting.
Mhm.
But that's a different topic for a different time.
Yeah, that happens to a lot of artists. So they get famous for this one song that's maybe not really indicative of like their overall like genre or tone or like offering. And then it's like, well, but that's what you're known for.
Well, it becomes a problem because they want to play other songs and no one is interested until the
How,
last couple songs because that's
how
what they're all
dare
known
they?
for.
How dare they? They want to play other songs. As a manager, I'm like, you're not playing the hit? What's the problem with you?
Give the people what they want.
Yep.
At least a little bit. At least a little bit. But, it also, I mean, in dealing with artists and having to play, that song, it does really present a challenge. Like, it's really interesting to see it. And as a musician myself and so forth, not having any hits per se, but just understanding that, wow, you have to play the same songs. It can be a lot. I really appreciate what they go through with that. It's an emotional. It can be an emotional, ride to do that every night, and very interesting to think and to find out how it's not discussed very often, but how people deal with that, having to play the same songs every night, like hence the reaction to that by certain artists like Bob Dylan, who won't play. It's a very interesting thing to be known for and then have to deliver and the expectation. I mean, Pavement had that. And in these tours, these reunion tours, I thought they did a really good job of handling that. In New York City, when Pavement played, they did different sets each night. I think it was
Mm-hmm.
four nights or 5 nights that they were played, and they did different sets each night, and people were then discussing like, well, which set did you get? Which songs
Right.
were there for you, which was super cool. Of course, they only allowed me to go to one particular night for me, and I'm a little pissed at them about that. So, Bob, I'm really pissed at you. Kidding. Um, no, they're great. They're so helpful. They were so helpful with the book. So I'm very very grateful.
Let's go back and talk about this art book.
Okay, yeah, the pavement
So
art book.
you knew Steve, yeah, the Steve Keene Art Book, which there is a essay in here from Stephen Malcolmus, and there's a little
Uh,
section in here about the pavement trees and stuff.
yeah, there's a quote. Yes, there's a quote from Stephen, in there. There's yeah, they were they're so helpful in helping to get this book together and so helpful in getting the word out about it. It wouldn't have been made without their help. So I'm very appreciative to them, helping make the Steve Keene art book.
And so, how far back do you go with Steve?
So Steve Keene and I met in 1993 or four. I worked at a record label, and one of the articles in the book is on a venue called the Threadwaxing Space, which was a short-lived but important venue and art space where indie rock shows took place. And Steve Keene got his start really in New York, or he credits getting his start in at the Threadwaxing Space, where he would basically hang his pieces from floor to ceiling, hundreds of pieces at a time. And as he still does, he offers them for a few dollars a piece, to be purchased on an honor system with cash in a big wood container that you stick your cash in, and you just pick off the wall what you want, put on the honor system, give them 5, 10, $20 in the honor system till, and you walk away with art. And it was as simple as that. And he was always at the. It seemed like he always had artwork up at the Threadwaxing Space. And so when I worked at this record label called Zero Hour, we ended up doing the Threadwaxing Space Live, the presidential compilation, and he was the obvious choice by the Threadwaxing Space people to be their visual component for their album, and so they chose him. And I was lucky enough to work at the record label and go see lots of shows at the Threadwaxing Space. And I was then introduced to Steve as the person who was providing the artwork for the commercial vinyl and CD product that we were going to put out, and cassette at the time too. And then he came into the office. They said, "Here's the cover," and I had a designer on hand who also was a big part of the book, named Ryan McGinnis. Wrote a big essay on Steve Keene's process and how he works, and as it would be, Ryan was who I had hired as a freelancer all the time at Zero Hour. He was so talented, and so I basically then had them work out how it was going to work. Ryan put together this package. It was Steve's images. It was Ryan's design. And we had the Threadwaxing Space Live record that was made, which included a bunch of real indie stuff, but including Guided by Voices and a band called Governor and BQE. But these were all bands that played and played important roles in the Threadwaxing Space's history. And so it was a really cool thing to meet him at that point. And then from there, on and off, I would hire him for different album projects where he would create original album artwork for the label. We did a Christmas album that was a takeoff on a Phil Spector album that was called A Christmas Carol for You, I think, or something along those lines. And where I had, it wasn't so unusual, but at the time it felt like I'm going to have Steve recreate this Phil Spector album, but in his hand. But as it would be, that's what he does. Yes, Steve Keene, for those that don't know, is the painter not only behind the Steve Keene Art Book, but is known for painting his record collection. So there's a whole section of the book of album covers that are called album art tributes. And these are basically albums that he was a DJ, so he either played these records on his radio show himself, or he loved the design of the album art that he could then replicate in his own hand. And so these are all what fascinated me about his work at first. It was more in the line of, okay, he did Wowie Zowie. Okay, he did Fun Trick Noisemaker. Okay, I hired him for the Threadwaxing Space and this Phil Spector record and a couple other things. Cool. But then I realized as I was getting on with it, that he had all these other sides to him artistically. And over the years, I collected other works from him that are not music-based. Maybe they have a nod to something music-based, but these are just other pieces that he had. And so I just love it all. Anyway, so my history with Steve is, nearing 3 decades at this point. And I realized, in terms of why the book was made, which is probably the next question, is that anticipating questions is my specialty. It just seemed like, wow, I have all these pieces. I'm a big collector of his. There's lots of big collectors out there. Shouldn't there be a book? And it just didn't seem like anyone was jumping up to do it. And I just think it became like this thing where it was too big to consider being done. For those that don't know, Steve Keene is perhaps the most prolific painter in the history of histories. He's painted over 300,000 pieces by his own hand. I think it's more like 400,000 at this point, because that number has been 300,000 for about 10 years. He paints 50 pieces a day, 4 days a week. And he's been doing this for 30 years.
That's insane.
And so, and it is insane. It's truly insane, but it's beautiful also. And it's beautiful to watch him paint all these different pieces at once. And they're not 50 of one type. They're usually 4 of a kind, and usually between 10 and 12, 10 and 15 sets. So here he's basically, he has just to describe this for people, how he works very briefly. He has a studio in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, where he has something called the Cage. It's a chain link fence cage, literally. I think I think it's 8 foot high. It's probably 14 feet by 14 feet by 14 feet, or something around that. And it's a cage, and he hangs pieces of 3/8 inch plywood you know, 50 pieces of plywood around the cage as his easel. And then, in essence, in rows and columns, four of a kind, 12 sets to 15 sets at a time each day, he paints these pieces. And he paints them by color. So and like a screen printing process. So big swashes of color first with as the paint. Then he might have to mix more paint. So slightly different swatch next to it. And then it goes around and around with acrylic paint. For those that don't know, acrylic paint is a quick drying paint. So he can literally like do paint one column of art on one level, if you will, then go to the next column and do that column. And by the time he works his way all the way around the cage in a somewhat circular motion, that first one that he started with has dried, so he can paint over it the next layer. So he's basically going around and around and around and around all day long, painting these 50, 60 pieces at a time until he's done. And he starts at 8 a.m. and he finishes at 5 p.m. And that's what he does every day. And he's done this for 30 years. And so, again, in knowing this, I was lucky enough to work with him and see him do this so many times. It's such a beautiful thing to watch. It's really interesting to me how his mind is operating, because I don't know if I'm painting myself a good enough picture in describing this, but it's like playing four-dimensional chess, like painting 50 pieces at a time. You're trying to figure out if you have enough paint to do this highlight, how you're going to get to the next painting, and what that painting is, because each set, again, is a different set. There's four of a kind, 12 to 14 or 15 different sets at a time. So he's painting from referencing one photo on each column. So again, I don't know, this might be a little too deep in terms of the description, but the point is there's a lot to do. He does it really quickly, and somehow his mind is attuned to work this way. And to me, it's just fascinating.
Yeah, no, I mean, that is such a unique process and a unique way to like go at this. Like, I love hearing that. And especially just thinking about the composition of one piece, in and of itself is like such a unique thing to be tackling. But then to be doing it, all around like the room with like so many different compositions and having to time it, like across the different pieces. No, I find that totally fascinating.
One of the other things that's a little easier to describe, but is also fascinating to me about him, again, I'm just fascinated by the guy. So, like, I'm just an Uber fan, really, is what it comes down to. But if you were to buy pieces from him, which you can from stevekeene.com when he allows you to, sometimes he doesn't allow you to, but it's a one-page website. It has a 1 or 2 line description that says when it's open, when the store is open, you can order from him. It says 6 pieces for $70, including shipping, randomly selected, and there's a buy button. You don't get to choose what you're buying from him. Well, there's secondary markets online at eBay. You can find his stuff, and you can choose one specific from someone that they're selling. That's fine. But if you're buying from him, you don't get to choose unless it's a show that you're at, you see him painting. If you're buying from his website, you don't get to choose. And there's something really beautiful about a self-curated package of paintings that arrives between 3 and 6 months after you get it, that just arrives, and it's wood, and it's like the size of a small microwave. And he usually puts in 8 pieces, 9 pieces. And he's curating it for you. And there's something uniquely special about that. And again, so I think what he does visually is striking and special. I think the way he delivers it is striking and special. And if you add all this together, that he's been doing this for 30 years, he's been providing art for the people at an access point where anyone can afford this type of art, or most people can afford this level of artwork. We're not talking about going to a Christie's auction. We're not talking about going to a Chelsea gallery. We're talking about everyday people being able to get real art painted by hand, one person's hand. It's just to me, this is a really special thing that should be celebrated, that he's offered this. And much like the 90s music scene, the punk band Fugazi, who was known for doing 20 years of shows for $5 tickets, no matter what. Everything was a $5 ticket. No matter where you went, it was $5. Much in the same way, Steve Keene has delivered artwork. And I think there's something truly beautiful about the way this is being handled. It's very, I don't think he necessarily thinks it's beautiful. I just think it's about him. It's about efficiency. He creates his pieces. He needs to get them out the door. He doesn't want to sit with them. This is true. He does not want the inventory to be sitting around. It's got to get out. He paints, 200, 300 pieces a week. They all have to go out because he doesn't have room to store them all. So for him, it's like, okay, I got to get them out. That's why you're getting 8 pieces instead of 6, because I don't know, get it out. It's a crazy thing, but this is true. Like, it's very true. Just the other day, I brought back a piece. It's a piece of furniture that I got from a retrospective that I put on. And it's a bench, and it wasn't painted. He's a woodworker amongst other things because he worked with wood primarily. So he made these benches. People could sit and look at his art with his bench that he made for his show. I wanted one of these pieces. I took the bench, and it wasn't painted. So I brought it back to him. I said, "Hey, Steve, can you paint this one too?" He looked at me like, "Oh man." Like, I'm taking advantage of my position at this point. But I told him, I know this is not something, because he doesn't want anything to be returned. That's the thing. He doesn't want the piece there. Not because he doesn't want to do the painting. Mm-hmm. It's more like he's already moved on from that piece. It left the studio. The boat has left the dock. Like, it does not... big cruise line does not come back,
only looking forward, not back.
That's right. One of the other things about the book that's interesting is, he didn't want anything to really do with the book, in terms of input. I would have been perfectly happy to get input from him, but he was like, no, it's your thing. Because he's only looking forward. He doesn't want to look at it. And I think even today, he would if he was being interviewed, he would probably say that he hasn't seen the whole book yet, because to him it's about working. It's about the art is him working. He wants to paint every day. That's what he does. So it's my job. It's our job to celebrate him if we want to celebrate him. It's my job to make the book whatever book I wanted to make, because it's not going to be what he wants. If the book itself to him is. It encapsulates a greatest hits. Well, that's what it's supposed to be. That's the biggest compliment I could get from it. It is a greatest hits. I curated the book because I wanted to find the things I thought would resonate with the most people, and showcase also the broad scope of his works as best I can, because who knows if anyone will ever make another book on him. I hope someone does, because there's surely enough material to do it. But if not, it better be the biggest badass book that you'll find, because it's got to represent this guy who has affected thousands of people's lives just by distributing it by hand, by care, to all these people around the world. So it needed to represent. That's one of the reasons why it's such a big book, is that it needed to show the volume of his work. He's made all these pieces, given all these away. The packages that arrive to people are huge packages that arrive to people. It needed to show the love that he gives to us. It needed to be represented in this book, and I hope that comes across.
Yeah, it's an amazing book.
Well, thank you. We tried really hard. That was the goal. The goal was to make a great book. The goal was to celebrate an artist that has truly affected me and helped me to realize that I can collect things. They don't have to be, $10,000, $2,000. It just is meaningful to me. This is what art is meaningful to me in this way. The pieces that I have that mean the most to me, that many of which are in the book, are ones that I got for $5 or $10 that were just humorous pieces. One of them I'll describe visually is a bust of former President Richard Nixon. Not my favorite president by any stretch, but by Steve's hand, my favorite president for sure. It's a bust of Richard Nixon, and he generally, when he does his work, he puts some type of non sequitur copy or text on the painting, and it's usually to draw people in, to ask people to look at it a little more carefully. And it's always something. A lot of times, it's something very funny. In this case, so it's Richard Nixon bust, and it says, "We saw Beck at Knitting Factory." What? Like, why would this? But, and that to me, I wake up to that. It's in my bathroom. I wake up to that every morning. It makes me laugh. It's still like, I got that, 25 years ago. It still makes me laugh. That's when you have to do something, I think, from my world as a producer. When things resonate for 25 years, well, okay, we should probably make a book on this. And if no one else is jumping up to do it, I guess I'm the guy to do it.
Before we continue with our episode, here's a word from our sponsor.
Enjoy listening to podcasts and ever wonder, can I make a podcast? But it seems so complicated, and good audio production can take time. What if there was a way to create an amazing podcast easily? Well, now there is. Introducing Podcasting Made Easy from Podtastic Audio. My production team will handle your entire audio production, allowing you to be the star of your show. This is Podcasting Made Easy. How easy? Well, so easy, you don't even have to press record. Now that's easy. Your listeners are waiting. Let's deliver. Sign up for a free strategy call today at podtasticaudio.com/easy.
Do you know how he got involved with that one Stephen Colbert episode where he was dueling with the Decemberists?
Oh my God, that's a great story. This is one of my favorite stories of all time. I'll try and synthesize it because it can go long because I'm a little wordy if you haven't noticed. But it's really interesting. At one point, he was a huge Colbert Report fan, Colbert Report, the first show, fan. One of the wonderful things about Robert, when he was making more music and we were working more closely together about this stuff, is whenever he wrote a hit song in his head, was a hit song, hit being whatever he thought was the catchiest song ever of the day, he would call me. And sometimes that would be more than once a day, and sometimes it was most of the time it was every day. He'd call me and he'd leave a message, say, "Dan, you'll never guess what I did." I'm like, I'm listening to my voicemail, like, I know what you did, Robert. You're going to say you think you wrote a hit song, and I'm going to be happy because of that, because who isn't happy hearing that someone else is so happy about what they just created, and then you get to represent it? Like, it's the most beautiful thing. So I would constantly get voicemail messages, "Dan, you'll never guess, I wrote this hit song." I'm like, "Yes, awesome, you wrote a hit song," and that made me feel good too. But anyway, so he said at one point, he called me and he said, "Dan, I wrote this song for Stephen Colbert. Do you think you can get it to him?" I was like, "Well, did you record it yet?" "No." "Okay, we'll go record it." Anyway, there was a certain time frame where they were working on this end of year show where Stephen was doing a guitar contest. It was like a guitar playing contest, and it was called Countdown to Guitarmageddon. And so it's being announced that this is happening, but the show, it's still off in the future, but they've announced it because it's such a funny title. And I think they're also trying to just get the word out because it was the end of the year. It's kind of a big show. They wanted to promote it, and Robert heard this. And Steven says he's gonna play, and he's gonna be part of this guitar duel. I have a song for him. It became Steven is the song, and it's available to check out. It's super funny. It's basically, Robert said, I wrote Steven like the best rally song. So in essence, like, he's going to listen to the song, he's going to get inspired to win. So he wrote a song like to his hero, Stephen Colbert, as that to get him ready, like a coach would get an athlete ready before a big game. That's what Steven is. and it's super hilarious. And so the next day, literally, he sent me a demo, which was the recording of it, and I was like listening to it, laughing my ass off. And it's so funny and so great and so catchy and just in some ways so stupid but so funny. And so in any case, I got it, and he's like, "Well, can you get it to Stephen Colbert?" I don't know, look, I'm gonna try. Like, we have people, we have record label, try. And lo and behold, what happened was I sent it. First person I sent it to was our publicist. Her name's Allison Elbow at the time. Still her name, but she was our publicist at the time, not anymore. But she's awesome. And Allison, I sent it to her, and she said, I asked her, like, "Hey, do you have any contacts with Colbert? Maybe you can get it to someone over there. Don't know, maybe." And she's like, you know that my partner sitting next to me is Colbert's press agent, right? No, why would I know that? Like, that never came up before. How would I know that? So she's like, I'm going to play it for the first time, and she's going to hear it right now. I'm going to bring her over. And so she immediately said, like, they're laughing hysterically about it. She's like, "Oh, they're going to send it to Steven directly immediately." And so this was like, I got it on I think that literally Robert first mentioned he was going to record it on a Monday. I got it on a Tuesday. I sent it off on a Wednesday. She got it that Wednesday. On Friday, we got a call from the show to ask if Robert would play on the show. Within a week, we had got on the next Monday. By the next Monday, we had been offered this. Robert had been offered to ask to play on the show. So within a week of writing this song and a day of recording it, and then a day of getting it to the publicist, we had gotten offered this. Found out down the road that Steven walked into the production meeting on Friday night of that first week singing the song. I mean,
I love that. Like, I picture him listening to it before every time he has to like go record a show, right? Like, he is pumping himself up with the song.
It's a rally song. It's a Stephen Colbert rally song. So how did this happen? Robert Schneider.
Yeah, I heard.
That's how.
Isn't Steven also like just in general like a big like Elephant Six fan?
Yeah, he used to play all kinds of E6 stuff before his shows, like to warm up the audience and stuff like that. So it was really always been. I mean, that's what he said to me. I mean, I'm not close with Steven, right, but we did have that conversation.
But I'm sure when he was like, Robert Schneider wrote me a song, like, I'm sure he wasn't like, who's this Robert Schneider guy?
Oh, no. He definitely was not like that at all. It was definitely like he knew who Robert was. And he's like, I think he's a massive Neutral Milk Hotel fan. So he knew that Robert produced those albums and co-wrote a lot of those songs, etc. So like, he knew. But by the same token, he had the rally song of all rally songs. Right. Now, you'll have to have me on another time, or we'll have to talk offline about the actual performance of that song on the show, because that's a longer story and equally fun and amazing, and only Robert Schneider could accomplish this in this particular way. Just happy to have been along for the ride.
Yeah, we'll have to save that story for when Nicole's feeling better, because I'm sure she would love to hear that story.
Yeah, she's going to be very envious of this episode.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel. Huge honor to have you on the show.
Oh, the honor is mine. Thanks for a fun conversation, and being able to talk about the Steve Keene Art Book is always something I'm super excited to do. So thank you so much for being interested.
So if people want to find the art book, where is the best way to find it? I know you could find it on like Amazon or wherever you can find books. But the
best way to get it is literally at Hat and Beard Press. So it's I'm just gonna type it out here because I always forget that I screw things up here. But yeah, it's called Hat and Beard, HATANDBEARD.com. Hat and Beard is my co-publisher on this, and they're really the best place to get it. You can of course get it on Amazon, but it would be better if you went this particular direction. But anyway, yeah, just don't worry about where you get it. Just go get it.
Cool. And we'll put that in our show notes. So if you want to find the book, you can check the description, and we'll have links to Daniel's webpage and to Hat and Beard Press.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the chat. I hope that it was as fun for you as it was for me.
Yeah, it was great. We'll have to have you back,
well,
especially when Nicole doesn't have a Fever 101.
Oh, what would be really cool is if you wanted to, I don't know if I can get him to do it, but if you ever wanted Robert to do something, that'd be awesome. I swear to God, it would change your life.
Yes.
It would totally change your life. Yes. I'm serious.
Tomorrow? Just kidding, but yeah, we would love to have Robert on.
All right, cool. Well, anyway, I really do appreciate it, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks for joining us this week on Soundtrack Your Life. Make sure to visit our website, soundtrackyourlife.net, where you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a rating. Or if you'd simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us out too.